The station floated above a world that wanted to kill everything on it. Varthka was a jungle planet where nothing was safe, and nothing was small, and nothing ever stopped hunting long enough to sleep without one. I opened the Galactic Veterinary Station called Kindred Mercy, hung in orbit above this nightmare world, like a metal angel, trying to save creatures that would eat it if they could dr. Skrithol stood at the observation deck and watched the shuttle rise from the surface below, and he felt his antennae go flat against his skull, because he already knew what was inside that shuttle something. Terrible something that had killed more sentient beings on Varthka than any disease or disaster or war. Vareth Mahler, he was a Vilathi, and his people were tall and thin with bodies like glass sculptures and compound eyes that could see in 12 directions at once, and every single one of those directions was currently screaming at him to run, but he was a doctor and doctors do not run. At least that is what he told himself every morning when he woke up on a station full of monsters. The station director Morval came up behind him, and Morval was a Gorthian, which meant he was gray and enormous and had 6 arms and a face that looked like someone had carved disappointment into stone. Morval said the Mauler was in bad shape and that the field team had found it half dead in a collapsed ravine, with a broken leg and infected wounds and 3 cracked ribs and internal bleeding that was slowly killing it from the inside. Skrithol asked why they brought it here instead of letting nature take its course. Morval gave him a look that could have frozen a star and said, because we are veterinarians and not executioners. Critchell felt shame crawl up his throat, but the shame was not stronger than the fear, and the fear was ancient and biological and carved into every cell of his body by a million years of being prey. Then Morval told him something worse. He said a human was coming. A human veterinarian had been assigned to the station as part of the Galactic Exchange program, and she was arriving today on the same rotation cycle, and she would be helping with the Mauler. K. Skrithol felt his legs lock. Humans were new to the galactic community, and everything about them was wrong in a way that made other species deeply uncomfortable. They were Class 12 persistence predators, which meant they did not chase fast and they did not strike hard, but they followed you. And they never stopped following you, and they could run for days without resting, and they could eat almost anything, and they healed from wounds that would kill most species, and when they were hurt, they got angry instead of dying. But the worst thing about humans was the way they smiled. They pulled back their lips and showed you their teeth, and every prey species in the galaxy felt a cold ancient terror when they saw it, because across 1,000 worlds on 1,000 evolutionary paths, that expression meant only one thing: I am going to eat you. Shuttle docked 20 minutes later, and Dr. Alara Voss walked onto the station like she owned it. She was small, that was the first thing Skrithol noticed, and it confused him because he had expected something larger and more terrifying. But she was barely average height for a human, with dark hair pulled back and hands that were covered in thin white scars and eyes that were brown and warm, and moved across everything with a calm, steady attention that felt almost predatory in its patience. She smiled at him. Every instinct in his body fired at once, and he took a half step backward before he could stop himself. She noticed, and her smile changed into something softer, and she said, "Hey, I know the teeth thing is weird for a lot of species, and I am sorry, and I promise I am not going to eat any." Own Skrithol did not find this as comforting as she probably intended. Morval briefed them both in the command center, and he pulled up the holographic scans of the Mauler, and the room went cold and quiet. The creature was enormous and 6-legged, with armor plating across its back and skull, and rows of venomous spines along its spine that could inject a neurotoxin capable of stopping a heart in 11 seconds, and its jaws had a bite force that could shear through starship hull plating like paper. It was the single most dangerous land predator on Varthka, and Varthka was a world where everything was already trying to kill you. Morval said the creature was in extreme pain and highly aggressive, and that no veterinarian on staff had been willing to get within 10 meters of the containment. Baskerthal understood this completely. Studied the holographic scans and said nothing for a long time, and her eyes moved across the data with that same patient predatory focus, and Skrithol realized she was not afraid, she was thinking. She asked about the containment field specifications, and Morval told her. And she frowned and asked what frequency the field operated on, and Morval told her that too, and her frown deepened into something that looked almost like anger. She said the containment field was hurting. She said the Mauler's spines were electrosensitive, and the field was essentially sending constant low-grade pain signals through the creature's entire nervous system, and that every safety measure they had put in place was driving the animal insane with agony. The room went very quiet. Morval asked what she suggested. Alara said she wanted to go in. Skrithol felt something cold move through his chest like ice water, and he opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out because the idea was so insane that his brain simply refused to process it before anyone could argue or protest or scream the alarm in. Containment Bay 7 went off a sound that cut through the station like a knife. The Mauler sedation was wearing off ahead of schedule, and it was waking up angry. They ran not away from the danger, but toward it, and Skrithol hated that because every fiber of his being was screaming in the opposite direction. But his legs carried him forward anyway, because Alara was already sprinting down the corridor, and he was her senior colleague, and he could not let a human outrun him to his own patient, even though she was a predator running toward a bigger predator, and he was prey running toward both of them. The corridors of Kindred Mercy were white and sterile, and the alarm painted them red in flashing waves, and the sound was a high-pitched shriek that made Skrithol's antennae vibrate painfully. They reached Containment Bay 7, and the observation window showed them everything. The Mauler was awake. It was standing on 5 of its 6 legs, because the 6th was broken and splinted badly, and it was slamming its armored skull into the containment wall with a force that made the reinforced, transparent barrier crack in thin spider web lines. Each impact sounded like a bomb. The creature was massive, and up close, it was even worse than the holographics had shown, because you could see the way its muscles moved under the armor plating like tectonic plates shifting, and you could see the venom glistening on its spines, and you could see the fury and the terror in its 4 burning orange eyes, because Skrithol realized with a shock that it was not just angry. It was afraid. The containment field crackled and sparked against the creature's spines, and every time it did, the Mauler screamed, and the scream was not a roar of aggression, but a howl of pain that vibrated through the floor and into Skrithol's bones. Alara was right. They were torturing it. The other staff had gathered behind them, and Skrithol could feel their fear like a physical wave of heat at his back, and none of them were coming closer, and some of them were already backing away, and he could not blame them because he wanted to do the same. Alara pressed her hand against the observation window and watched the Mauler with an expression that Skrithol could not read at first. Then he realized what it was. It was grief. She was grieving for this monster. She turned to Morval, who had arrived behind them, wheezing on his 6 legs, and she said she needed the containment field dropped, and she needed it dropped now. Morval said absolutely no. Alara said the field was the problem, and that every second it stayed active was another second of agony, driving the creature further into panic, and that a panicked apex predator was more dangerous than an angry one, because anger had direction, but panic was chaos. Morval said he would not authorize a staff member to enter an unsecured bay with a Class 9 Mega Predatora. Lai said she was not asking for authorization. She said she was informing him of what she was going to do. The station went quiet in a way that felt like the silence before something breaks. Morval stared at her, and Skrithol could see the calculation happening behind the director's ancient eyes, and then Morval pulled up a liability waiver on his datapad and held it out to her. Alara signed it without reading it. Skrithol grabbed her arm, and he could feel the warmth of her skin through his fingers, and it startled Him because predators on his world were always cold-blooded, but humans ran hot like furnaces, like engines that never turned. Offie said she could not do this, and that the creature would kill her before she took 3 steps, and that this was not bravery but suicide. Lara looked at him, and her brown eyes were steady and calm, and she said something that carved itself into his memory forever. She said, "It is not trying to kill anyone, Skrithel, and it is trying to survive, and right now, it thinks everything in this station is trying to hurt it, and it is right." She pulled her arm free gently and picked up her medical kit and walked to the containment bay door. Staff watched her like they were watching someone walk off a cliff. Skrithel positioned himself at the emergency sedation controls, and his fingers were shaking so badly he could barely hover over the buttons, and he told himself he would fire the moment the creature lunged, and he would not let this insane human die on his watch. The containment field dropped. Buzzing electric hum that had filled the bay went silent, and for one heartbeat, everything was still. The mauler stopped slamming into the walls. Its massive head swung toward the door, its 4 orange eyes locked onto the small figure standing in the opening. Lara stepped inside. She moved slowly, and her boots made soft sounds on the metal floor, and she kept her eyes slightly lowered and her hands visible and open at her sides, and she breathed in a slow, deliberate rhythm that Skrithel could hear through the audio feed. The mauler watched her, then it opened its jaws and roared. This sound was so loud it distorted the speakers, and Skrithel felt it in his chest like a second heartbeat, and the observation window vibrated, and 2 staff members behind him actually fled the corridor. The roar carried the smell of blood and infection and rage, and underneath all of it something that sounded almost like a question. Lara did not run. She did not flinch. She did not even close her eyes. She stood there in the mouth of that sound like a stone in a river, and she let it wash over her, and when the echo died, she was still standing and still breathing and still alive. The mauler tilted its head. That moment Skrithel saw something he had never seen in 30 years of veterinary work: confusion. The apex predator of Varthka was confused because nothing had ever stood still before. Everything runs from a mauler and everything fights a mauler. But nothing has ever just stood there and said with its body and its silence, "I am not here to hurt you." Creature circled her, and its massive clawed feet shook the floor with each step, and it snapped its jaws inches from her arm, and Skrithel saw the skin on her forearm prickle with goosebumps, and he could see her pulse hammering in her throat like a trapped birch. She was terrified. She was absolutely terrified, and she did not move then, slowly and deliberately, like it was the most important thing she had ever done in her life. Lara Voss knelt down. She lowered herself to the ground, and she bowed her head, and she placed her medical kit in front of her, and she opened it with movements so slow they were almost painful to watch. She made herself small. She made herself vulnerable. She made herself prey, and the most dangerous predator on Varthka stopped moving and stared at her with all 4 of its burning eyes, and the silence in that bay was the loudest thing Skrithel had ever heard. Nobody breathed. The entire station had gone silent, and the staff were pressed against the observation window like ghosts, and Skrethel's fingers were frozen over the emergency sedation controls, and his compound eyes were locked on the scene inside the bay, and he was watching a human kneel before a god of death. The mauler stood over her like a mountain of armor and muscle and venom, and its 4 orange eyes burned down at this tiny soft creature that had walked into its cage and chosen to be small. It did not understand. Skrithel could see that in the way the creature tilted its massive head, and in the way its spines rose and fell in uncertain patterns, and in the way its broken leg trembled as it shifted its weight on Varthka, everything had a role, and the roles were simple and ancient and unchanging. You were the thing that killed, or you were the thing that ran. There was no third option. There had never been a third option until now. Lara began to hum. It was a low sound and steady, and it came from somewhere deep in her chest, and it filled the bay like warm water filling a cold room, and Scrithol felt his antennae slowly unfurl from their flattened position against his skull, because the sound was doing something to him too. It was not a song, and it was not music, and it was not words. It was just a vibration that said, I am here, and I am calm, and you can be calm too. The Mauler's breathing changed. Scrithol saw it happen in real time on the biomonitors that lined the observation wall, and the creature's heart rate dropped from 340 beats per minute to 280, and then to 220, and its cortisol levels began to fall, and its spines, which had been rigid and dripping venom, slowly flattened against its back one by one like flags being lowered after a while. Alara kept humming. She did not look up, and she did not reach out, and she did not make any movement that could be interpreted as a threat or a challenge or anything other than what it was, a small creature kneeling on the ground. Saying, I trust you not to kill me, the Mauler took a step toward her, and the floor shook, and Scrithol almost hit the sedation button, but something stopped him, and later he would not be able to explain what it was, except that it felt like the moment before a wave breaks when everything hangs in the air, and you know that whatever happens next will change everything. Another step. Creature was so close now that its breath moved Alara's hair, and Scrithol could see on the monitors that her heart rate was 160 beats per minute, which was dangerously high for a human, and her adrenaline levels were spiked to a point that should have triggered a fight or flight response in any mammalian predator. She was running on pure will. Her body was screaming at her to run, and her mind was holding her body in place like chains made of choice, and Scrithol realized in that moment that he was witnessing something that his species had no word for, because in the Vielethi language there was a word for bravery, which meant not having fear, and there was a word for recklessness, which meant ignoring fear. But there was no word for what Alara was doing. There was no word for feeling the fear completely and fully and letting it flood through every nerve, and then choosing to kneel anyway. Mauler lowered its head. Its armored skull was the size of Alara's entire torso, and it came down slowly like a drawbridge and stopped inches from her bowed head, and it breathed on her, and the sound was like wind through a canyon. Then it made a noise. It was not a roar, and it was not a growl, and it was not anything Scrithol had ever heard a Mauler make before. It was quiet and low, and it came from deep in the creature's chest, and it resonated through the metal floor and up through Alara's knees and into her bones. Was a sound that meant something in a language older than words. It meant I heard. Alara's hands were shaking when she reached into her medical kit and pulled out a diagnostic scanner, and she moved so slowly that the motion was almost invisible as she raised it toward the creature's injured flank, and the Mauler flinched when the scanner hummed to life. Alara stopped. She waited. She let the creature decide. 30 seconds passed, and they were the longest 30 seconds of Scrithol's life, and then the Mauler shifted its massive body and turned its injured side toward her, and the movement was so deliberate and so clear in its meaning that several staff members behind Scrithol gasped. It was showing her its wound. It was exposing its weakest point to a predator. It was trusting her. Alara pressed the scanner gently against the creature's flank, and the data flooded the observation monitors, and it was bad, and it was worse than bad because the internal bleeding was more extensive than the initial scans had shown, and the infection had spread to 3 major organ systems, and the broken leg had been set wrong and was healing at an angle that would leave the creature permanently crippled, if not corrected. This animal was dying. It had been dying slowly and painfully in a cage, surrounded by creatures that were too afraid to help it, and the containment field had been burning its nervous system the entire time, and it had been screaming for help in the only language it knew, which was violence and rage, and everyone had heard a monster except the human. The human heard pain. Alara looked up at the observation window, and her eyes were wet, and her hands were still shaking, and Scrithol could see the tears cutting tracks down her face, and she mouthed 2 words through the glass. "Help me." Scrithal looked at the sedation controls under his fingers. Then he looked at the mauler lying beside this tiny human with its wound exposed, and its spines flat, and its 4 orange eyes half closed in something that looked impossibly like relief. Looked at his own hands. They were shaking too, but not from fear, from shame. He had spent 30 years as a veterinarian, and in all that time, he had never once walked into a cage with a creature that terrified him, and knelt down and said, "I am here to help you no matter what you are." He had always let the fear win. He had always backed away, and the human had knelt. Scrithal pressed the intercom button, and his voice came out steadier than he expected, and he said, "Send the surgical tray to Containment Bay 7, and then he said something that surprised everyone, including himself. He said, "Send 2 sets of surgical gloves," because he was going in too. The door to the containment bay was 3 inches of reinforced alloy, and when it opened it felt like the lid of a coffin. Lifting, Scrithal walked in, and his 12-fingered hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and his legs were shaking so hard he could hear his own joints clicking, and every compound eye on his head was locked onto the mauler like a targeting system that could not disengage. The creature raised its massive head when he entered, and its 4 orange eyes focused on him, and a low growl started building in its chest like an engine winding up, and Scrithal felt every cell in his body turn to ice. He stopped. He could not move. A million years of evolution had seized control of his limbs and bolted them to the floor, and his brain was sending one signal and one signal. Only run. Runalara did not look up from the wound she was cleaning, but she placed her hand on the mauler's neck, and she spoke in a voice that was calm and warm and certain. She said, "He is with me." The growl stopped just like that, like Alara had reached into the creature's chest and turned off a switch. And the mauler settled back down, and its eyes moved away from Scrithal and back to the human who was kneeling beside it. With gentle hands and steady breath, Scrithal took another step and another, and then he was kneeling too, and his hands were trembling as he pulled on the surgical gloves, and the mauler was so close he could feel the heat radiating off its body and smell the copper tang of its blood, and see the individual scales of its armor plating and the tiny scars that covered them, like a map of every fight it had ever survived. He was terrified, and he was exactly where he needed to be. They worked through the night. The station rotated through its artificial day cycle twice while they operated, and the observation window filled with faces that came and went as staff members watched in shifts, because no one could look away for long, and no one could watch for too long. Either the mauler's injuries told a story. The broken leg had been caused by a fall, but the internal bleeding had not, and when Alara opened the creature's abdomen with careful, precise cuts, she found something that made her go very still and very quiet. Burn marks. Deep inside the creature there were burn marks on its organs that were not natural and not caused by any fall or fight. And Scrithal recognized the pattern immediately because he had seen it before in seized cargo. Reports energy weapon discharge. Someone had shot this animal not to kill it, but to hurt it and weaken it and drive it into the ravine where the captured team had found it, and the realization hit them both at the same time like a wave of cold water. This was not an accident. This was a hunt. Someone was poaching Vareth. Mauler Cellara's jaw tightened and her hands stopped shaking for the first time all night, and something changed in her eyes, and Scrithal saw it, and it was not softness anymore. It was fury, a quiet, controlled, precise fury that burned like a white star behind her brown eyes, and Scrithal understood in that moment why humans were classified as persistence predators, because the look on her face said, "I will find who did this, and I will not stop until I do, and I will never get tired, and I will never give up, and I will run them down, no matter how far they go." But she said none of that. She breathed, and she steadied her hands, and she went back to work, because the creature on the table in front of her was still dying, and the justice could come later, but the healing had to come. Noscrithal marveled at that, the ability to feel rage and set it aside and pick up a scalpel. Instead of a weapon, they repaired the internal bleeding, and they cleaned the infection, and they rebroke and reset the leg, and Scrithal's 12 fingers moved with a precision that made Alara whistle low in admiration, and she said his hands were incredible, and he felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with temperature. Somewhere around the third hour, Alara started talking. She told him about Earth and about the animals there, and about how her species had a long and complicated history with predators, and how they had hunted wolves to near extinction and then spent decades bringing them back, and how they had driven tigers to the edge of oblivion and then built sanctuaries and bred them and fought wars of law and money and will to keep them out of the Scrithal. Asked why, he said, your species nearly destroyed these creatures, and then you spent enormous resources saving them, and that does not make logical sense. Lara smiled, and it was a sad smile, and she said, no, it does not. She said humans were not logical about the things they loved, and they were not logical about guilt either, and that somewhere along the way her species had looked at the empty forests and the silent mountains and realized that a world without predators was a world that had lost something it could never name but could always feel. She said they saved the wolves not because it was efficient, but because the silence where the howling used to be was unbearable. Scrithal thought about that for a long time. Then he asked her the question that had been building in him since the moment she knelt. He said, why do you help things that can kill you? Lara's hands paused on the Mauler's flank, and she looked at him, and her eyes were tired and honest, and she said, because something being dangerous does not mean it deserves to suffer. She said the measure of compassion is not whether you give it to things that are safe. She said the measure of compassion is whether you give it to things that could destroy you and you help them. Anyway, they went quiet, except for the steady beep of the biomonitors and the deep, slow breathing of the Mauler, who was stable now and sedated lightly and alive, because two doctors who were both afraid had chosen to kneel beside it and work. Through the night, Scrithal looked at his hands. They were covered in the creature's blood, and they were not shaking anymore. Ella leaned back against the Mauler's side and closed her eyes, and within minutes she was asleep, and Scrithal watched her with all 12 segments of his compound eyes, and he thought about how strange it was that the most dangerous species he had ever met was also the most gentle. The Mauler shifted in its sleep, and its massive tail curled around Alara like a wall. And Scrithal stared at this and could not process it, because the most lethal predator on Varethka was protecting the small creature that had saved its life. He sat there in the blood and the silence and the soft sound of breathing, and he thought, this is what humans are. They are not the strongest, and they are not the fastest, and they are not the most armored or venomous or powerful. They are the ones who kneel, and that is why the galaxy will never be ready for them. Then his communicator beeped, and Morval's voice came through heavy and grim, and he said 3 more Maulers had been found in the same region, all with the same energy weapon burns, and all injured and all dying, and the station was being asked to take them all. 6 weeks changed everything. The station that had once been a place of quiet fear became something else entirely, and the something else was loud and chaotic and smelled like blood and disinfectant and the strange musky scent of Vareth Maulers, who were slowly learning that not everything in the universe wanted to hurt them. They named the first one Singular, chose the name, and when Scrithal asked why, she grinned and said, because getting him to trust me felt like laying siege to a fortress. And I won by not attacking. Siege healed faster than anyone expected, and the creature that had once shattered containment walls with its skull now followed Alara around the bay like something that Scrithal could only compare to the Earth animals. She showed him pictures of on her data podogs, she called them. She said humans had taken wolves, which were wild predators, and over thousands of years turned them into companions and family, and the wolves had not become weaker for it, and the humans had not become prey. They had become something new together. The three knew. Maulers were harder. They were more badly injured and more traumatized, and one of them, a female that Alara named Tempest, had been shot so many times that her internal organs were a maze of scar tissue and burn damage, and she was so aggressive that even Siege kept his distance when she raged. But Alara knelt for each of them. Every single time she walked into a bay with a creature that could end her life in half a second. And she lowered herself to the ground, and she waited, and every single time eventually they stopped, because no one had ever knelt for them before. Skrithel helped with all of them, and each time was easier, and each time was also harder, because the fear never went away, and he was beginning to understand that it was never supposed to go away. And that was the point. Courage was not a destination. You arrived at it, was a door you walked through every single day, knowing full well what was on the other side. The investigation into the poaching ring moved fast once Alara got involved, and she attacked the problem with the same relentless patience. She showed the Maulers, and she coordinated with the Galactic Enforcement Authority and compiled evidence and tracked energy weapon signatures and mapped transport routes, and she did not sleep much during those weeks. And Skrithel worried about her, but he also knew better than to tell a persistence predator to stop persisting. They found the poachers, a syndicate of Kael'vari traders who had been capturing Maulers and selling them to private collectors across the outer systems as exotic trophies and combat animals, and the prices were obscene, and the cruelty was systematic. And when the enforcement teams raided their compound, they found cages and chains and weapons and records of dozens of Maulers taken over the past 3 years. Most of them were already dead. Alara did not cry when she read the report. She went very quiet and very still, and Skrithel recognized the expression because he had seen it once before on the night they operated on Siege. That white star fury burning behind her eyes. But she said nothing, and she filed the evidence, and she made sure the case was airtight. And she let the legal system work, because she had once told Skrithel that justice and vengeance looked the same from a distance, but only one of them builds anything. Then the video leaked. Someone on the station staff had recorded Alara's first encounter with Siege through the observation window, and they uploaded it to the Galactic Network, and within 12 hours, it had been viewed by more sentient beings than any recording in the history of Galmet. The galaxy watched a tall insectoid alien back away from a monster in terror, and then they watched a small human with scarred hands walk into the cage and kneel. The video was shared across 1,000 worlds and translated into 600 languages, and it was discussed by theologians and philosophers, and military strategists and xenobiologists and politicians and children and soldiers and prisoners and doctors, and everyone who watched it felt something move inside them that they could not quite name. Some called it reckless. Some called it the most profound act of interspecies compassion ever recorded. The Vilathi philosopher wrote that the video proved that the universe had finally produced a species that could break the predator-prey cycle, and that humanity was not an apex predator at all, but something the galaxy had never seen before, a healer that was not afraid to bleed. The attention made Alara uncomfortable, and she refused every interview request, and when a galactic news crew arrived at the station, she told them she was busy and closed the bay door in their faces and went back to cleaning Tempest's wounds. That was the day Skrithel decided to write. He started his monograph that evening in his quarters, with his 12 fingers moving across the keypad, and the words came slowly at first, and then faster, because he had been carrying them inside him for weeks, and they needed to come out. He wrote about fear, and about the biological imperative to flee, and about how every prey species in the galaxy had built its civilization on the foundation of running away from things that could kill them. And then he wrote about a woman who Knelt Siege was released on a Tuesday. They transported him back to Varathka, to a protected wildlife zone that had been established as a direct result of the poaching investigation, and the whole station came to watch and Alara stood at the shuttle bay with her arms crossed and her jaw tight and her eyes bright. The Mauler walked to the edge of the transport pad and looked back at her, and Skrithal swore on everything he had ever believed that the creature's 4 orange eyes held something that went beyond animal instinct and beyond conditioning and beyond anything that science could currently explain. It looked at her, and she looked at it, and something passed between them that was older than language and deeper than thought. Then Siege turned and walked into the jungle and disappeared into the green shadows, and Alara watched until long after he was gone. Skrithal found her in the empty bay that evening. She was sitting on the floor where Siege used to sleep, and her hand was resting on the spot where his massive body had been, and the metal was still warm. He sat beside her, not behind the glass, and not at a safe distance, and not with a containment field between them. Beside her, he told her that before she arrived, he had written a formal transfer request, and that he was going to leave Megafauna work forever because he was too afraid, and because he believed that fear was a wall he could never climb. Alara asked what changed. Skrithal looked at his hands, and they were the same 12-fingered hands that had trembled at the containment controls 6 weeks ago, but they felt different now, and they felt like they belonged to someone who had chosen something. He said, "You showed me that courage is not the absence of the instinct to flee." He said, "It is the decision to kneel instead." Alara was quiet for a long time, and then she leaned her head against his shoulder, and the warmth of her was startling and alive, and she said, "Thank you for coming into the bay that night." Said, "Thank you for showing me what it means to be brave." They sat in the silence of the empty bay, and outside the observation window the stars turned slowly above a jungle world where a Mauler with a healed leg and a body full of scars was walking free for the first time in months, and somewhere on 1,000 worlds, 1 billion beings were watching a video of a woman kneeling before a monster and learning something about humanity that no first contact protocol had ever prepared them. 6 months later, Skrithal's monograph was published, and it became required reading at every veterinary academy in the galactic community. And it was translated into more languages than the video, and it changed the way the galaxy understood, not just humans, but compassion itself. The title was simple 4 words, and it shook the foundations of how 1,000 species understood the small, soft, persistent predators from a little blue world on the edge of the Orion Arm, kneeling, how humanity's greatest predatory trait is compassion, and across the galaxy, in classrooms and hospitals and shelters and sanctuaries and everywhere that someone was afraid to help something that could hurt them, a new phrase entered the common language, a phrase that meant to choose mercy. When every instinct screams to run and to lower yourself before something terrible and say, "I am here and I will not leave," they called it kneeling, and they learned it from the humans.